Through its early years, Group C Sportscar racing was dominated by just one manufacturer, Porsche. With the 956 and 962, Porsche defined an era, winning Le Mans 6 times in a row. But by the late 80s, a new challenger was emerging. Swiping Porsche's long-held World Sportscar Championship crown in 1987, then ending their Le Mans winning streak too in 1988, Jaguar put an end to Porsche's dominance. And it was no fluke. Designed by Tony Southgate and built by Tom Walkinshaw Racing, Jaguar's early XJR series Group C cars were built for one purpose: to beat Porsche, which I'm sure they appreciated. Southgate's aim was to design a car that would exploit Porsche's weaknesses that not many people believed they had. He would come up with design concepts that would confound the engineers at Porsche and propel Jaguar to championship victory in 1987 and 88 for both the Constructors' and Drivers' Championships, as well as taking victory at the illustrious 24 Hours of Le Mans. So how did they do it? Southgate started working on Jaguar's Group C project right from the start, being brought in to design the XJR-9 for Jaguar's 1985 entry. He was given a massive V12 to work with. At the time, he said it was the largest engine he'd ever seen. Although the engine did show some promise, its sheer weight and shape would be a major challenge for the design team. But that was the job given to them. Southgate would have control over every other aspect of the vehicle, but whatever he designed, it had to be powered by that V12. Standing in Jaguar's way was Porsche. Their cars were incredibly reliable and, believe it or not, really fast. They had been at the top of the class since its inception. They were sleek and aerodynamically impressive for the time, but Southgate realised their obsession with long tails was far more of a weakness than anyone at Porsche knew. He sought to take advantage of this. Southgate had done some previous wind tunnel testing at the Imperial College London Wind Tunnel and Rolling Road while working on the Ford C100 Mark III. Porsche, meanwhile, had done their aerodynamic testing in a wind tunnel with a static road. This was enough information for Southgate to believe he had better data than Porsche, and on the off chance that Porsche had not accounted for this difference in aerodynamic testing, there might be an advantage there. We live in a stressful world. I know I'm not unique in being stressed out a lot, especially over the last couple of years. Life can be overwhelming at times, but that shouldn't mean you have to compromise on your happiness. This is an advert for BetterHelp Online Therapy, who can connect you remotely with a credentialed therapist either by phone, video call, or even just messaging if that makes you more comfortable. Therapists are trained to listen and give you helpful and unbiased advice regardless of how you're feeling. Go to betterhelp.com/automobilistic and you'll be asked to fill out a questionnaire to help see what's best for you. And in most cases, you'll be connected with a therapist within 48 hours or less. You'll be able to schedule sessions whenever is right for you, and if for whatever reason the therapist you've been matched with doesn't feel like the right fit, you can change at any time for no additional cost. Over 4 million people have trusted BetterHelp to help live healthier and happier lives. So if you feel that therapy might be right for you, you can go to betterhelp.com/automobilistic, help support the channel, and get 10% off your first month of BetterHelp. Thank you to BetterHelp for supporting the channel, and now back to the story of those Jaguars. The 1985 XJR-9 boasted a 6.2-litre naturally aspirated V12, a vastly different approach to Porsche's turbocharged flat 6. Unsurprisingly perhaps for a debut season, the XJR-9 didn't perform very well in 1985, managing 7th in the championship overall, though it is worth saying that of the 6 teams that beat Jaguar, 5 of them were racing Porsche 956 or 962s. The XJR-9 clearly needed some revisions to really take the fight to Porsche, and work began on a successor. That successor wouldn't arrive in time for the 1986 season, however, and so the XJR-9 would fight another day. They increased the engine displacement by 100 cc's and sent it out racing once again. It fared slightly better this time, coming joint third in the championship and managing a race win at Silverstone, but the team's sights were set much higher. For 1987, the XJR6's successor was finally introduced. The XJR-8 was powered by a monstrous 7-litre V12. Much of the rest of the car was pretty similar to its predecessor, but the newly enlarged engine gave the car 720 horsepower and a top speed of over 220 miles per hour. To improve downforce and do so with as little additional drag as possible, the advancement they made was that a large enough and correctly shaped rear wing could act effectively as an extension of the bodywork, creating an area of sufficiently low pressure as to pull air out through the Venturi tunnels in the floor of the car, greatly increasing the effectiveness of the ground effect most Group C cars were designed to take advantage of. Additionally, Porsche's boxer motor layout interfered with their ground effect tunnels, limiting the effectiveness of their floor's aerodynamics and leaving room for a competitor, maybe like Jaguar, to do it better. The XJR-8's ability to pull air out through the Venturi tunnels with its large wing meant that the tunnels could have a much steeper angle as they reached the rear of the car. This would increase effectiveness of the ground effect even further, and it was something that Porsche couldn't do even if they wanted to, because their boxer motor and transmission layout was already interfering with their shallower tunnels. Another area that Jaguar sought to improve over Porsche was the chassis. The 956 and 962 were based on relatively basic aluminium box frames, which were far from cutting edge. Southgate instead worked with Tom Walkinshaw Racing to create a carbon fibre monocoque chassis for the XJR series Group C cars, creating an incredibly stiff structure while also saving weight. The XJR-8's humongous 7-litre V12 was placed as far forward as possible, right up to the shoulder of the driver. Because of the weight of the engine and its relatively high centre of gravity, it dominated the vehicle's design and handling characteristics, easily offsetting the weight saving made by using a carbon fibre monocoque. But the placement of the engine, along with the car's aerodynamic design, meant it was able to generate a hell of a lot of downforce. As a bonus, it had around 40% of its aerodynamic downforce over the front end, as opposed to Porsche's 25%, increasing front end grip and instilling that little bit of extra confidence for Jaguar's drivers to push it a bit further. The results speak for themselves. 1987 was a year of huge success for the XJR-8, which managed to win 8 out of 10 races in the WSC, only losing twice to Porsche 962s. While this bagged Jaguar an extraordinarily large winning margin over second place Brunn Motorsport, it was not without disappointment. One of the races they had lost was Le Mans, and this was a race Jaguar could not leave unwon. 3 XJR-8s had contested Le Mans in 1987, 2 of them failed to finish, and the third was relegated to a 5th overall finish, after fighting gearbox trouble through much of the later stages of the race. 1988 would see a further evolution of Jaguar's design with the XJR-9. The car was very similar to the outgoing XJR-8, but that's not surprising given the success the XJR-8 had enjoyed in 1987. If it ain't broke and all that. Their focus was on Le Mans though this time. For the Jaguar team to stand a chance of winning at Le Mans, they would need to survive race distance unlike they had the previous year, and they'd also need to beat Porsche on the straights. To do this, Southgate and his team worked to reduce the drag of the car until it had a theoretical top speed of 240 miles per hour. The Porsches could achieve 235, which gave Jaguar just a 2% boost over the Porsches, but that's all they needed. The low drag variant was so drastically different to the normal XJR-9 that it was differentiated as a different car. It was the XJR-9 LM. The result was a huge success. The XJR-9, much like its predecessor, took the World Sportscar Championship by storm, winning 6 out of the 11 events. Crucially for Jaguar, this included victory at Le Mans. A huge moment for the team, who had ended Porsche's championship winning streak the year prior, and now Porsche's Le Mans winning streak as well. The silk-cut Jaguar team were crowned manufacturers' champions, and Jaguar driver Martin Brundle was given the Drivers' Championship too. While this Jaguar had been set up to beat the Porsches, in 1988 their biggest competition had actually been Sauber Mercedes, who had actually beaten Jaguar at a number of events. It became clear Jaguar had a new enemy. The concern was that Sauber Mercedes potentially had a higher performance ceiling, as instead of Jaguar's naturally aspirated and enormous V12, they were using a twin-turbocharged V8, which not only potentially produced more power than Jaguar's V12, but did so while weighing less and taking up less space. Jaguar had to act if they wanted to stay competitive. Unfortunately, they did this too late. For 1989, they started the season with the XJR-9, and perhaps unsurprisingly for a car that was now ultimately a few years old, the car was out of date. Development was underway on the XJR-11, an evolution of the XJR-9, with an updated chassis and underfloor to increase the downforce from the ground effect even further, and it had a new engine. Much like the upcoming Jaguar XJ220 road car, the naturally aspirated V12 would be replaced by a turbocharged V6 based on the engine found in the Metro 6R4 Group B rally car. The thinking was that this smaller engine would be able to produce about as much power, but without a hugely heavy and unwieldy engine needing to be stuffed into the car. The XJR-9 didn't perform very well at the beginning of the season, but from round 4 at Brands Hatch, the new V6 XJR-11 would be in use. Unfortunately, this didn't fare much better. Lacking pace against the Sauber Mercedes C9 and running into serious reliability issues. Sauber Mercedes crushed them in the championship with very little competition at all. The same was true for Jaguar in IMSA as well, where the GTP XJR-9 was replaced by the XJR-10, very similar to the 11, and it wasn't enough to save a relatively poor season for Jaguar. The XJR-11 would be Jaguar's WSC car for 1990 as well, and despite increasing the engine displacement from 3 litres to 3.5 litres, it just wasn't enough to fight for WSC victories. They won one race in 1990 at Silverstone. There was one race that year, however, that wasn't on the WSC calendar, and it was a big one: Le Mans. Jaguar wanted to win Le Mans, and with their primary WSC rivals Mercedes not fielding the C11 at Le Mans that year because it didn't count towards WSC Championship points, Jaguar seized the opportunity to find some success amidst their recent failure. The car they raced at Le Mans was called the XJR-12, but it wasn't so much a next generation as more of a previous one. While the XJR-11 was stuck using the pretty unreliable new V6, the XJR-12 got the old 7-litre V12 back, and even just looking at the car, it's easy to see it bears quite a striking resemblance to the XJR-9. Probably no accident, given that car had been Jaguar's last to win at Le Mans. This worked out well. Jaguar managed to win Le Mans with the XJR-12 LM in 1990, proving that Jaguar's success wasn't just a flash in the pan, they just needed to bin off that V6. For 1991, the controversial 3.5 litre formula was pushed onto the top class in the WSC, C1. Older, non-conforming C1 cars would be able to contest the lower C2 class with heavy restrictions. For Jaguar though, this was a good excuse to swap out their troublesome Metro-based V6 for a 3.5 litre naturally aspirated V8 courtesy of Ford. It was the same engine used by the Benetton Formula 1 team. In fact, the 3.5 litre formula being used by C1 from 1991 was pretty much exactly the same engine rules as were in place in Formula 1. It's believed F1 wanted Group C manufacturers to be building Formula 1 style engines so that they could try and convince them to either field Formula 1 entries or become engine suppliers to other Formula 1 teams. More cynical people believed it was actually a ploy to kill off Group C because of its high viewing figures in comparison to Formula 1 at the time, making it serious competition. Either way, the results were dire for WSC, but it soldiered on for a few more years. While Jaguar could have contested C2 with one of their older cars, they chose to instead stay in the top-flight C1 class, where their primary competition would be Mercedes and Peugeot. Jaguar also brought in a new design team for what would become called the XJR-14. And in keeping with the F1 theme the WSC was attempting to foster, Jaguar hired Ross Brawn as the design lead, while TWR would continue in their capacity as constructor. The new rules, which had not only overhauled engine requirements but many other aspects of the sport as well, had ditched the fuel consumption limits that had defined Group C for years. This resulted in many of the new generation C1 cars being extremely light and having huge amounts of aerodynamic downforce in comparison to their predecessors. Race 1 of the 1991 season at Suzuka, and Peugeot managed to win with their 905, a shock result as it was expected that Jaguar would have the fastest car. Race 2 at Monza, and Jaguar found their feet, taking victory with their new XJR-14 and its race-proven V8, something that could not be so easily said for Peugeot's V10 and Mercedes' ridiculous flat 12. Race 3 at Silverstone, and again the XJR-14 took victory, showing unparalleled manoeuvrability that its competitors simply could not match. Race 4 was Le Mans, and in 1991 this was a bit of an odd one. Mercedes had been having serious reliability issues with their C291, and ultimately they chose not to race the car at Le Mans, believing that there was absolutely no chance at all that it would survive. They chose instead to field one of their older C11s in the C2 class and take the penalties. Jaguar had planned to use their new XJR-14 but came to the same conclusion, choosing as well to run an older XJR-12 with heavy restrictions in the C2 class. Peugeot chose to compete in C1 with the 905, and the car proved deeply unreliable over the grueling 24 hours. Proving that Mercedes and Jaguar had probably been right. Le Mans was won by the Mazda 787B, which found itself in a unique position as the only C2 car that had been categorised as C2 both before and after the engine rule change. This meant that it competed in the C2 class without the restrictions placed on the other C2 cars that had previously been competing in C1 prior to the changes. It was still a hard-fought victory for Mazda, who got everything right on race day and deserved the win. It was their only win of the season. Race 5 was at the Nürburgring, and Jaguar were back on form, taking victory in Germany. Peugeot had a trick up their sleeve though. The 905B would be brought in to replace their 905 for the remainder of the season, and the following two races were won by their new car, upsetting what was looking like it was going to be a cruise to the finish for the silk-cut Jaguar team. The final race of the season saw a shock victory for Sauber Mercedes, who managed to win at Autopolis. But the season was already over. Jaguar had done it. They had secured another Manufacturers' Championship, with Jaguar driver Theo Fabi taking Drivers' Championship victory as well. After 1991, Jaguar saw the writing on the wall for Group C in the WSC and chose not to compete any further, ending their time in the sport on a high note. The car they were considering developing for use in the WSC for 1992 was the Jaguar XJR-16, which they had been racing in IMSA through 1991, with some success. It had picked up 4 wins at Road Atlanta, Mid-Ohio, Laguna Seca, and Road America. Unfortunately, its time competing was cut short, and while Jaguar did continue to compete in IMSA over the following couple of years, they did so with the XJR-14 instead, which saw some success. The XJR-14 was a car that even after the end of its IMSA career would go on to form the basis of another Le Mans winning prototype. Check out the story of the TWR Porsche WSC 95 here. Thanks for watching, and until next time, goodbye.